So as I just mentioned, this is the last week of 4 in this series focused on diversity, inclusion, equality, and equity. Key biblical concepts, indivisible parts of the Christian message. And if you've thought, as we've gone through these 4 weeks, that, boy, there's a lot more we could say about diversity. There's a lot more different kinds of diversity that we could focus on. You're right. And we may come back around to this and talk about some of those things down the road. But acknowledging that, what you need to know is that we've shot 2 bonus videos in this series. And in the email that goes out, not tomorrow because the office is closed, but on Tuesday, you're going to get links to those 2 bonus presentations. The first one is a conversation between me and Jim Mershon, who taught together the first week of the series, where we try to go into greater depth about those key biblical ideas that we've been exploring in the series, and even apply them more directly to KirkWood's life. But then in the other bonus presentation, we focus on one specific kind of diversity, people who have disabilities. And we have an expert in our congregation on that subject, and she and I had a great time talking for 35 or 40 minutes because we didn't have the constraint of a worship service. So we rambled on together for a while. But it is just fascinating and riveting, and she provides all kinds of wisdom for us on how to include and respect and offer dignity to people who have disabilities. So you'll get those links. I hope you enjoy listening to those bonus presentations. All right, today, our subject, and Bob and I went round and round this week on what a good title for today would be, is the multiracial future of America and the church. And my co-presenter today is going to be Dr. Bob Craig. But before we get into the meat of the presentation, I want Bob to tell you just for a minute about his own personal passion for this subject and why.
I would like to answer that question by quoting some practical advice, which I took from the last Monday memo from our resident anthropologist, Rachel Fisher, which is, 1, be self-aware of your own cultural identity. Understand where your motives for your traditions come from. The books and pamphlet you see on the slide are just a sample of my readings on Presbyterian history. In their pages, I find the courage to face that which divides us by learning about the sacrifices made by our predecessors of all races and ethnicities to build the church as God intended. But I'm reminded by my 86-year-old mother, a white woman who married a black man in 1957 and who worked as a community organizer in a predominantly black neighborhood in the 70s, that as time passes and memories fail, the younger generations must come to the forefront of leadership. And I would add, they must do so with a deep appreciation of the past, a firm understanding of the present, and a bright vision of the future. So I hope today that we are able to continue this journey that we are on for a better understanding of our church.
So there are going to be 3 components to our presentation today. The first of which is Bob is going to paint you a picture with numbers. He's going to talk to you about the multiracial future of the country, and then also the present reality of mainline Christianity. And we note, by the way, that a lot of the data up here on the screen may be small. If you go back and view the video on your computer, it'll be easier for you to see, but Bob's also going to tell you what he wants you to see or hear on each of the slides that we go through. So take it away, Bob.
So, having said that, don't be overburdened by the amount of data on the slide. We're going to walk through it, okay? We got bubbles and highlights to focus on the data that really, really is important at this point in time. 2, For those mathematicians that are in the audience, I'm going to tell you right up front, without seeing the footnotes that go with these charts, sometimes the totals don't add all up, and sometimes the percentages don't add to 100%. Please don't let that distract you from the main point of the slides. And finally, we have a strategy. What I was hoping to do is start us off with national level demographics and national level projections, then narrow it down to the demographics of mainline Protestant denominations, and then finally end up with the demographics of the Presbyterian Church USA. And I hope by doing that, you see some trends that are consistent. Next slide, please. Mm-hmm. So here's the first thing I want you to take away. And again, terms are important. So everybody uses different terms. You'll notice a differentiation between white and non-Hispanic white. That's because according to the people who generate these categories, the Hispanic ethnicity can be of any race. So sometimes the numbers are double counted. But let me just say this, the non-Hispanic white population is projected to shrink over the coming decades, even as the US population continues to grow. This decline is driven by falling birth rates and a rising number of deaths over time as a non-Hispanic white population ages. Next slide. Additionally, although non-Hispanic whites are projected to remain the single largest race group in the US throughout the next 22 years, beginning in 2045, they are no longer projected to make up the majority of the US population. Next slide. This changing racial makeup of the United States is most visible among our children. By 2060, the share of children who are non-Hispanic white is projected to fall from 1/2, you see that 51.1% in 2016, to about 1/3, that 36.4 million. Next slide, please. So here we get down to our denomination. The data on this slide is from the Pew Research Center 2014 Religious Landscape Study. Please note that the demographic profile of white mainline Protestant does not reflect the demographic trends in the broader society. So what I did is I took their slide and I reordered it, and I put the highest percentage of congregational memberships of whites at the top all the way down. But you see, even as you go down, there's still a majority, 73%. And then at the top, it's 96%. Next slide, please. So here we get to PCUSA, very, very current numbers. Thanks, of course, to the clerks who submit these numbers every year. We're able to tabulate them for those congregations that report it. As you examine the racial diversity numbers associated with our denomination, please note that the overall percentages have not really changed from the previous slide, which was built from 2014 data. And that's that 88% that you saw on the previous slide. So if these overall membership percentages have not significantly changed in the last 9 years, then PCUSA congregational membership data from 2012 might provide some insight about the makeup of our congregations today. For example, in 2012, 98% of white Presbyterians belonged to mostly white congregations, and only 1% of white Presbyterians belonged to predominantly racial ethnic congregations. And a racial ethnic congregation is considered a congregation where fewer than 20% of the members are white. So you see a trend here using the best available data that we can get from both the census and various other studies, that the demographics of the United States is changing rather dramatically, especially by 2060.
So what Bob and I want to do is spend the rest of the time talking through the work of a pastor who wrote his dissertation on this very subject. And Bob discovered it as he was prepping for today. So first, what Bob's going to do is walk you through what this dissertation says about a few strategies that don't really work if done in isolation, but then he's going to walk you through some more strategies that promise to be more effective as Presbyterian churches like us face the reality of a changing country, racially and culturally. All right, so take it away, Bob.
Okay. So as Pastor Chris mentioned, when I was preparing for this, I got very lucky. I mean, think about it. How often do you find a 180-page dissertation that is exactly the topic that you're talking about for your congregation, okay? So I reached out to this pastor, and unfortunately he was out of the country. So I'm going to have to be very, very strict about interpreting his work. So I'm going to give credit all to the pastor here. As the pastor is Reverend Dr. Watermulder, I hope I pronounced his name correctly, was both extremely relevant and current. His dissertation it was 180 pages, but today we're only going to focus on two parts. The pastor had common proposed solutions, as Pastor Chris has mentioned, in isolation don't work, and proposed actions for the church. Next slide, please. So what are the common proposed solutions? The book club approach, the sister church model, the integration or merging model, nesting, ignorance is bliss, and starting over. Due to time, we're only going to look at the first two, okay? Come on, movement, yes, thank you. All right, next please. All right, so the first common proposed solution is the book club approach. This is a strong indication that people are open to learning, to listening, and to finding ways to talk about a very hard topic. However, education-oriented events used by themselves are rarely transformational for a congregation. Next slide, please. The sister church model reflects the long practice of predominantly white PCUSA congregations establishing sister church partnerships with churches of different racial ethnic makeups. Sometimes the sister churches are geographically close, and sometimes they are quite distant. For example, our sister church in the Republic of the Congo. But once again, although there are several benefits associated with the sister church model, this approach rarely leads to congregational membership being transformed or significantly shaped by the encounter. Next slide. So if the common proposed solutions are not the answer, what's a congregation to do? The researcher's answer to this question are his proposed actions. The proposed actions are defined by the researcher as a research solution which calls for consistent leadership, the development of cross-cultural competencies, and a renewed desire to design ministry for the communities as they really are. There are 11 actions associated with this solution. However, today, we're only going to examine the first 3 actions, which are listed on the slides. I'll try to identify the pros and the cons. So, first action, vision and values and mission. For you ruling elders out there, I'm sure this rings right to your heart. Okay? The first action emphasizes the importance of keeping the vision continually in mind and the way of inviting and focusing the congregation. It is only when churches keep their highest goals and values in mind that they can discover the way that reaching out and ministering across racial ethnic lines is actually part of their purpose. And the Reverend made a very, very strong point on this, as you see in the bullet on the slide there. A congregation should not seek diversity for diversity's sake. Very, very rarely has that ever been successful. Next slide, please. I think most of us will agree that talking about race is not easy. Consequently, when it comes to addressing diversity within the church, it will take informed, inspired, and consistent leadership to wrestle with the mixture of motives and the actions into a single, comprehensive strategy. Next slide, please. And finally, my last slide addresses the need for building consensus. The key point for this proposed action is that pastors cannot do it alone. Our Presbyterian tradition of lay leadership reminds us of the importance of our ruling elders, our staff, and the key influencers if a congregation is going to be guided towards a greater cross-cultural ministry. That's it.
So when Bob and I got together in my office for the last time on Wednesday, we were talking together about what we hope the outcome of today would be. And the word that he used, which is a great one for anyone who remembers coffee makers from 50 years ago, is we want it to percolate. Because there are no quick fixes to this, right? You heard that in the solutions that Bob talked through, but there are no quick fixes. In many mainline denominations, many Presbyterian churches are in the same situation we are, which is that our congregation does not reflect the diversity of the communities around us. So there are many congregations addressing this, asking about this, wondering about this too. So what I want to do today is talk you through the portion of this dissertation that grounds the subject of multiracial and multicultural diversity in good theology. And really, it's going to be a good capstone for the series as a whole, not just a conclusion to what you've heard Bob and I talk about. So up on the screen is a direct quote from that section of the dissertation. Then I'm going to parse it out for you a little more. He writes, "The church has a calling to draw people together from every nation and background. If the chief end of man has to do with glorifying God and enjoying God forever, as the Westminster Catechism teaches, then the chief desire and telos, which means completion or maturity, of the church includes extending the goodness and grace of God to all those around her." Let me take you back to the 1st century AD, the era of Jesus and the very first Christians and churches. It was largely an urban movement. Churches in the 1st century world spread out across the metropolitan areas of the Roman Empire. And what we know about Roman cities is they were, like we like to say about America in its history, a melting pot. There were all different kinds of races, ethnicities, and cultures present in these Roman cities. But, like in so many of our cities, there was also overt segregation. If there was a diaspora Jewish population in a Roman city, they would quarantine themselves into only a certain neighborhood in that city. If you were a sailor or you worked in the merchant field, then you would live and do your work and be sequestered down by the docks, down by the sea. If you were in any way associated with the religion of your particular city, then you would be up on the Temple Mount or live close to the Temple Mount. If you were one of the Roman aristocrats, if you were part of the Roman power structure, then you would live near the governor's palace, or you'd live close to the Roman fort that housed the Roman soldiers that kept the peace. But their cities looked a lot like our cities. Diverse, yet separated. And yet, the first Christian churches, as you've heard me say before in the course of this series, were the only place in the 1st century world where diversity expressed itself and was celebrated and was also unified because of this person, Jesus. So on the one hand, the first Christian churches reflected the diversity of their context. On the other hand, the unity that they had in that diversity had not been seen anywhere else. Now, why? Why were the first Christians so focused on the issues of inclusivity and diversity in their congregations? Well, a lot of it has to do with how they understood themselves in the grand narrative of Scripture. It has to do with the Old Testament footing and foundation of what they were doing. For example, St. Paul writes extensively in Galatians 3 that the work of the church is nothing more and nothing less than the fulfillment of an ancient promise made to Abraham. The beginning of the nation of Israel really starts in Genesis chapter 11 at the end, and then the beginning of Genesis 12, where God calls one family to a very specific purpose. And part of that purpose we hear in Genesis 12:3 is that Abraham, in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. 4 more times God reiterates the promise to Abraham over the course of his lifetime. And all 4 times a phrase like that is repeated. Through you and through those who carry your promise, all peoples and all nations will be blessed. Thus, Brian McLaren says, whatever else Christianity is, it is a religion of blessing. We are those who have been blessed by God, who are then asked to share that blessing with everyone. No strings attached. All peoples, all nations, all tribes. And see, when you look for it, you will find this global perspective or focus all over your Old Testament. For example, Psalm chapter 72, verse 17. May God's name endure forever and his fame continue as long as the sun. May all nations, not Israel, may all nations, which includes Israel, be blessed in him, and may they pronounce him happy. Isaiah the prophet, of the major prophets in the Old Testament, is the one who highlights this purpose of God for Israel and those who follow after Abraham the best. For example, chapter 25, verse 6. On this mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all people a feast of rich food, a feast of expensive wine, of rich food filled with marrow, and of vintage wines strained clear. All peoples. So you see, you and I stand in the line of Christians who understood themselves to be those who inherited the promises made to Abraham. And the promise made to Abraham is, number one, you have been blessed by God in the gift of Jesus and all that comes with him. And now you should make it your aim and purpose to go and bless all people. No restrictions. And oftentimes that is best seen in our inclusivity and diversity. I want you to remember back to what those wise, courageous South African Christians said about Christianity as articulated in the Belhar Confession that we affirmed about 20 minutes ago. They said that the gospel, the good news of Jesus, is not merely about God reconciling us to himself. No, it's bigger than that. It also includes God trying to reconcile us to each other. And that means across lines that normally separate people, be it race or anything else. They go on to say that, great turn of phrase, the unity that God gives us the opportunity to live is both a gift and an obligation. It is something we should, I quote again, pursue and seek and continually build. Unity in diversity is not possible without God, but God will not do the work for us. We are supposed to do it ourselves. But then they go on to say, if the church does not embrace eliminating the hostilities and distrust between people groups seriously, then what we're really doing is removing part of the gospel itself. they say, quote, undermine the gospel. What if you and I took diversity and inclusivity to be an indivisible part of the good news we celebrate in Jesus week after week, year after year? And what if we said that we will be the one place that the world and community can look and see a diversity that is gracious to one another and loves each other and respects each other in a way that our world and country right now cannot figure out? Part of the story that Bob didn't tell you, but I will, about why it is that mainline Christianity has shrunk so much in the last 50 years, is because we're not diverse. He showed you that in Numbers. What we've chosen to do is travel the route of comfort and ease, which is just to be with people like us. And in so doing, we've lost part of our effectiveness as the light of the world and the salt of the earth. Diversity is part of the gospel. Overcoming the issues that so commonly separate people is part of why Jesus came. Without intentional focus on diversity and inclusivity, our gospel is not whole. Let's take a minute here at the end of this last presentation and the series as a whole to pray for our church and our calling to be diverse and inclusive. I want to be quiet first, and I just want you, where you are at home or in the pew, to offer up your own personal quiet response to what you've heard this morning in prayer. And after a moment or two, I'll pray for us all. Our good God, really what we've been doing over the course of the last month together is celebrating your gift of shalom, goodness and peace that affects every aspect of our lives. Peace with you, peace with creation, finally peace with ourselves, and yes, peace with each other, no matter how different we may be. Lord, I ask that you would call us forth to be a church that prioritizes and is intentional about diversity, inclusivity, equality, and equity. Convince us anew that the good news of Jesus is incomplete if we do not seek that together. And by our efforts, by our obligation, by our noble pursuit, may your kingdom increase in this place, in our community, and in our world. This we ask together. Amen. Would you thank Dr. Bob for being a part of this presentation today?